Today we're going to take a look at the bio of Marcus Aurelius. I'm going to be reading the Gregory Hays introduction from Meditations. There's a lot to unpack here. Let's get into it. States will never be happy until rulers become philosophers, or philosophers become rulers. Marcus Aurelius is said to have been fond of quoting Plato's dictum, and those who have written about him have rarely been able to resist applying it to Marcus himself. And indeed, if we seek Plato's philosopher-king in the flesh, we could hardly do better than Marcus, the ruler of the Roman Empire for almost 2 decades, and author of the immortal Meditations. Yet the title is one that Marcus himself would surely have rejected. He never thought of himself as a philosopher, who would have claimed to be, at best, a diligent student and very imperfect practitioner of a philosophy developed by others. As for the imperial throne, that came almost by accident. When Marcus Annius Verus was born in AD 121, bystanders might have predicted a distinguished career in the Senate or the imperial administration. They could hardly have guessed that he was destined for the imperial purple, or seen in their mind's eye the lonely bronze horseman whose upraised hand greets us from the Capitoline Hill in Rome across 2,000 years. Marcus sprang from distinguished enough family. The year of his birth coincided with his grandfather's second tenure of the consulship, in theory Rome's highest office, though now of largely ceremonial importance. It was to be his grandfather who brought him up, for his father died when he was very young. Marcus makes reference in the Meditations to his father's character as he remembered in or heard of by others, but his knowledge must have been more from stories than from actual memories. Of the remainder of his childhood and in his early adolescence, we know little more than what we can gather from Meditations. The biography of him in the so-called Historia Augusta, a curious and unreliable work of the late 4th century, probably based on a lost series of lives by the 3rd century biographer Marius Maximus, tells us that he was a serious child, but also that he loved boxing, wrestling, running, and falconry, that he was a good ball player, and that he loved to hunt. None of these are surprising occupations in an upper-class youth. Book 1 of the Meditations offers glimpses of Marcus' schooling, and we can fill out the picture by what is known of upper-class education generally at this point. His first instructors, like the unnamed teacher mentioned in Meditations 1.5, were probably slaves, from whom he would master the rudiments of reading and writing. At a later stage, he would have been handed over to private tutors to be introduced to literature, especially, no doubt, Virgil's great epic, the Aeneid. But literature served only a preparation for the real goal. This was rhetoric, the key to an archived political career under the Empire, as it had been under the Republic. Under the supervision of a trained rhetorician, Marcus would have begun with short exercises before progressing to full-scale practice declamations in which he would have been asked to defend one side or another in imaginary law cases, or to advise a prominent historical figure at a turning point in his career. Should Caesar cross the Rubicon? Should Alexander turn back at the Indus? Why or why not? Such training was conducted in Greek as well as Latin. Since at least the beginning of the 1st century BC, the Roman upper classes have been essentially bilingual, and Marcus's spoken and written Greek would have been as fluent as the French of a 19th century Russian aristocrat, or the Chinese of high-end Japanese courtier. Marcus would have read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and the tragedies of Euripides side by side with the Aeneid, and studied the speeches of the great Athenian orator Demosthenes as intensely as those of the Roman statesman Cicero. It was Greek writers and artists who constituted the intellectual elite at the capital, when in later life the emperor conversed with his court physician, Galen. He would have done so in the latter's native tongue. Above all, Greek remained overwhelmingly the language of philosophy. In the late Republic and early Empire, writers like Lucilius, Cicero, and Seneca had worked a great philosophical literature in Latin, with notable success. But the great thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, Theophrastus, Zeno, Chrysippus, Epicurus, etc., had all been Greeks. Serious philosophical investigation required a familiarity with the language they wrote in and the terminology they developed. That Marcus composed his own meditations in Greek is natural enough. In 137, when Marcus was 16, a crucial event took place. The reigning emperor, Hadrian, was childless. An illness had brought him near to death a year previous, and it was clear that he would not live forever. Hadrian owed his throne to his adoption by his predecessor and distant relative, Trajan. Following Trajan's example, Hadrian designated the distinguished aristocrat Lucius Senonius Commodus to succeed him. In 137, however, Senonius died unexpectedly, and Hadrian was forced to cast about for a new successor. His choice fell on the childish senator Antoninus, whom he selected with the proviso that Antoninus should in turn adopt Marcus, his nephew, by marriage, along with Senonius's son Lucius Verus, then aged 7. Marcus took on the family name of his adopted father, becoming Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. Hadrian's death the following year left Marcus first in line for the throne. His education and that of the younger Verus were now matters of still greater concern, and it is clear that no expense was spared. For training in Greek rhetoric, he was entrusted to Herodias Atticus, a famous wealthy Athenian rhetorician whose tempestuous relationship with his family, fellow citizens, and the imperial court itself would have furnished ample material for a soap opera. His instructor in Latin oratory was Marcus Cornelius Fronto, a prominent rhetorician from Sitra in North Africa. By an accident of fate, many of Fronto's letters to Marcus have survived, and they illustrate the close relationship between student and teacher. They also suggest Fronto's regret at seeing Marcus move away from rhetoric to delve ever more deeply into philosophy. The first book of the Meditations pays tribute to a number of philosophers from whom Marcus learned, both formally and informally, and he is likely to have studied or listened to many others. Marcus would have learned from outside the classroom as well. For training in legal and political matters, an informal apprenticeship bound aristocratic youths to older public figures, men like Junius Rusticus, whose influence Marcus chronicles in 1:7. But the single greatest influence was surely Marcus's adopted father, Antoninus Pius. Marcus would have watched Antoninus receive embassies, tried legal cases, and dictated letters to his deputies. Meanwhile, Marcus's own position as their apparent was signaled in various ways. In 140, he served as consul at the age of 19, and served again in 145. In the same year, he married Antoninus's daughter Faustina, to whom he pays tribute in Meditations 1:17. Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire describes the reign of Antoninus as furnishing very few materials for history, which is indeed little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. It furnishes equally little material for Marcus's biography. In the decade and a half between 145 and 161, we learn little of Marcus's occupations, and our only glimpse of his inner development come from his correspondence with Fronto. But the two poles that would govern the remainder of his life, the court and the philosophy, seem by this point to be fully established. There is no evidence that Marcus experienced anything like the conversion to philosophy that some ancient figures experienced or affected. But it is clear that by the middle to late 140s, philosophy was becoming increasingly central to his life. On August 31, 161, Antoninus died, leaving Marcus as his sole successor. Marcus immediately acted to carry out what appears to have been Hadrian's original intention, perhaps ignored by Antoninus, by pushing through the appointment of his adopted brother, Lucilius Verus, as co-regent. Verus's character has suffered by comparison with Marcus's. Ancient sources, in particular the gossipy Historia Augusta, tend to paint him as a self-indulgent degenerate, almost another Nero. This may be unfair. It is certainly not the picture of him we got from Marcus's own reminiscences in Meditations. It does seem clear, however, that Marcus functioned as a senior emperor in fact, if not name. It would be surprising if he had not. He was almost a decade older and had been trained for the position by Antoninus himself. What kind of ruler did this philosopher-king prove to be? Not perhaps as different from his predecessors as one might have expected. Though an emperor was all-powerful in theory, his ability to control policy was in reality much more limited. Much of his time was spent fielding problems that had moved up the administrative ladder, receiving embassies from the large cities of the empire, trying appeals of criminal cases, answering queries from provincial governors, and dealing with petitions from individuals. Even with a functional system of imperial couriers, news could take weeks to travel from the periphery of the empire to the center. Imperial edicts could take time to move down the chain of command. While the emperor's decision had the force of law, enforcement was almost entirely in the hands of provincial governors, whose diligence might be affected by incompetence, corruption, or an understandable desire not to antagonize local elites. We get occasional glimpses of Marcus's day-to-day duties from the evidence of imperial decisions preserved in letters, inscriptions, and the legal codes. Surviving the legislation shows a certain interest in the freeing of slaves and in regulations relating to the guardianship of orphans. Attempts have been made to tie the first of Marcus's philosophical convictions and the second to his own memories of life without a father. But it remains unclear how much of the policy is due to Marcus himself and how far it differs from that of Marcus's predecessors, Antoninus. Perhaps more interesting are the traces of Marcus's personality to be discerned in the phrasing of imperial documents, where we find a scrupulous attention to detail and a self-consciousness about linguistic usage that seems to differentiate Marcus from his predecessors. Neither trait surprises in the author of the Meditations or a student of Fronto. Those extant letters place great stress on the quest for the mot juste. One of Marcus's priorities was to preserve good relations with the Senate. The goal was to disguise the absoluteness with which the emperor ruled, to preserve a facade, and sometimes, no doubt, even to achieve the reality of consensus and cooperation. 100 years before, aristocrats might have dreamed of a restored republic, as some certainly did. But by the 2nd century, it was clear that there was no alternative to the Principate. The Senate expected difference in public and hoped for influence behind the scenes. Good emperors were willing to play along. In cultivating the upper classes, Marcus was following in the footsteps of Antoninus and Trajan, rather than Hadrian, whose relations with the Senate had been prickly. And it is this, as much as anything else, that is responsible for his reputation as a benevolent statesman. An emperor might do as he liked while he lived, but it was senatorial historians, men like Cornelius Tacitus in the 120s or Cassius Dio in the generation after Marcus's death, who had the last word. Another area where Marcus's policies continued that of his predecessors related to a small and eccentric sect known as the Christians. In the course of the next century, they would become an increasing problem for the imperial administration, and they were prominent enough in Marcus's day to attract an extended denunciation from a certain Celsus, part of whose work against the Christians still survives. The sect met with contempt from those intellectuals who deemed to take notice of it. Marcus's tutor Fronto was evidently one, and with suspicion and hostility from ordinary citizens and administrators. The Christians' disfavor stemmed from their failure to acknowledge the gods worshipped by the community around them. Their atheism, their refusal to accept any god but their own, endangered their neighbors as well as themselves, and their reluctance to acknowledge the divine status of the emperor threatened the social order and the well-being of the state. Christianity had been illegal since the early 2nd century, when a query from Pliny the Younger then governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, prompted the Emperor Trajan to establish a formal policy. While Christians were not to be sought out, those who confessed to the faith were to be executed. But empire-wide persecution did not become a reality until a much later date. The main threat of Christians in the 2nd century came from individual provincial governors, acting either on their own initiative or under pressure from local communities. In the late 170s, for example, civic unrest at Lyon resulted in a virtual pogrom of Greek-speaking Christians resident there. Marcus's mentor, Junius Rusticus, had tried and executed Christians, the apologist Justin Martyr among them, in his capacity as city prefect. Marcus himself was no doubt aware of Christianity, but there is no reason to think that it bulked large in his mind. The one direct reference to it in Meditations, 11.3, is almost certainly a later interlopian, and an implicit reference from scholars have discerned are surely illusory. Marcus, in any case, had more serious concerns than his troublesome cult. Soon after his accession, relations between Rome and his only rival, the Parthian Empire in the east, took a dramatic turn for the worse. Since at the least the time of Trajan, the two states had been locked in a cold war that would continue for the next 2 centuries, and that once a generation or so flared up into military conflict. The death of Antoninus and the accession of 2 new and untried rulers have tempted the Parthian ruler Vologeses III to test the waters. In 162, his forces occupied Armenia and wiped out a Roman garrison that had gone to the rescue. Syria itself was threatened. Rome had no choice but to respond. It was Verus, the younger emperor, who was sent east, where he would remain for the next 4 years. Neither he nor Marcus had any military experience to speak of. Antoninus's peaceful reign had given little scope for it, and the day-to-day conduct of the war was no doubt left to the professionals. After initial setbacks, the Romans rallied, and under such commanders as the dynamic young Avidius Cassius, forced the Parthians to sue for peace. Parthia would remain a threat, but one that could be dealt with by diplomatic means for the immediate future. Verus and his senior colleague had no time to bask in their triumph, however. Within a year, the empire was in the grip of devastating plague, apparently brought back from the east by Lucilius's troop. Its effect may not have been as quite apocalyptic as later writers suggest, but the death toll was certainly high, and it also delayed the emperor's response to a second threat. This was the increasing instability of the empire's other border, the northern frontier, that separated Rome from the barbarian peoples of Germany, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia. During this period, a number of these tribes were under pressure from peoples farther north and reacted by moving across the empire's borders, not for conquest, but in search of land to settle. Rome's reaction alternated between aggressive resistance and attempts to accommodation. Its failure to develop a workable policy would eventually result in the collapse of the Western Empire some 3 centuries later. In some places, a line would be drawn. Hadrian's Great Wall, stretching across Britain, was intended to secure the empire's most distant frontier. Under Antoninus, it had been briefly superseded by a second line farther to the north. But such fortifications were impractical on the continent, and it was there that the threat was concentrated. Rome still remembered the catastrophe of AD 9, when the Roman general Varus and 3 legions had marched into the forests of Germany, never to return. In the 2nd century, the greatest source of anxiety was the area farther south, roughly corresponding to modern-day Romania and Hungary. Trajan's conquest of Dacia 2 generations before had cleared out a possible source of trouble, but the potential for friction remained. In Marcus's day, 3 peoples presented a special problem: the Quadi, the Macromani, and the Jazyges, also called Sarmatians. The removal of 3 legions to Parthia had seriously weakened the Roman position on the northern frontier, and barbarians took advantage of the situation. In In 168, Marcus and Varus marched north to deal with them. Much of the remainder of the reign would be spent on intermittent warfare, first in the so-called Marcomannic Wars of the early 170s, and then in a second campaign later in that decade. And most of the burden was to be borne by Marcus alone, for Varus died suddenly, apparently of a stroke, in early 169. It was a very different kind of war than the traditional campaign Varus's armies had waged. The conventional military and diplomatic tactics that worked against the Parthians were to have limited use here. Instead, the Romans had to negotiate with individual chieftains whose authority was limited to whose reliability was always in doubt. When negotiation failed, the only alternative was a slow and bloody succession of small-scale engagements rather than pitched battles. The progress of the campaign is recorded on the column erected in Rome to commemorate the close of the Marcomannic Wars. In spite of its triumphal purpose, the engraved scenes that spiral around the monument paint a grim picture of brutal fighting, devastation, and execution. Spiders are proud of catching flies, Marcus notes mordantly. Men of catching hares, fish in a net, boars, bears, Sarmatians. The gruesome vignette that opens Meditations 834, a severed hand or foot or a decapitated head, may well reflect Marcus's own experience. By 175, the Romans seem to have gained the upper hand, but at this point disturbing news arrived. Avidius Cassius, who had distinguished himself as a general during the Parthian War and who was governor of Syria, now served as virtual regent of the Eastern Empire, had revolted and declared himself emperor. Some of the eastern provinces, notably Cappadocia, remained loyal to Marcus, but Cassius was recognized as emperor throughout much of the east, and in particular in Egypt, whose grain supply was crucial to the capital. Civil war seemed inevitable and was prevented only by Cassius' assassination at the hands of a subordinate. Marcus was nonetheless obliged to travel east to reassert his authority, taking with him Faustina, who died in the course of the journey. He visited the major cities of the east, Antioch and Alexandria, arriving finally at Athens, where he was initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries, a set of mystic rites connected with the worship of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture. Now in his 50s, Marcus was in decline in health, and the revolt of Cassius had only underlined the need to make arrangements for the succession. Faustina had borne at least 13 children, many of whom had died young. By the mid-170s, Marcus had only one surviving son, Commodus, just entering his teens. There is no reason for Marcus to continue the policy of adoption followed by his predecessors, and there is no reason to think he even considered it. The years that followed see Commodus' rapid promotion to a position not far short of co-emperor. He was consul in 177 at the age of 15. In the same year, he was accorded all the major imperial privileges, except for the post of Pontifex Maximus, the head of the Roman state religion, held by the reigning emperor alone, and for life. The gains of the Marcomannic Wars had not proved permanent, and in 178, Marcus and Commodus marched north again. 2 years later, Marcus died at age 58, the first emperor to pass on the throne to his son since Vespasian a century before. Sadly, Commodus's performance did not bear out whatever promise Marcus had discerned in him. He was to be remembered as a dissolute tyrant, a second Caligula or Nero, whose many defects were only emphasized by the contrast with his father. His assassination after a 12-year reign would usher in the first in a series of power struggles that would burden the empire for the next century. And if you like that video, then you can always check out my book that talks about those issues and many more to help you through some of the hard times in your life. It's got a title so edgy, I'm not even sure if I can say it on YouTube. So check it out in the description, And as always, stay tuned for more videos to help you through those hard times, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing for all that other fun stuff with the algorithm, you know? Yeah, like, subscribe, write a little comment about how I'm silly or whatever. Do it. Do it now. Yeah, there you go. Wasn't so hard to do, right?